Sounds good. So thank you so much for the introduction. And I love that I can see the names of folks on here. So major shout out to the St. Paul's Hospital Pharmacy Department, where I worked for a number of years, and some of the former classmates of mine and colleagues, etc. And to everyone I don't know, thank you for spending this time to learn a little bit more as we can all do a little bit better together. I included a QR code on this first slide, and there's also a QR code on the final slide, as I do have copies of a handout version of this presentation, as I know folks like to access it that way and revisit it later. So I'll be showing it right now, and then also at the very end of the presentation. I was asked by my friend and colleague Kelsey Dumont to offer some education for folks through the Sask Health Authority, and we landed on this one. So framing or reframing Indigenous peoples in your everyday practice. So I'm going over some basic, but also can be very complicated terminology, tips and traps. And terminology is constantly changing. Words matter, phrases matter, pronunciation matters too. And so I hope to clarify as much of that as I can today within the confines, of course, of a 45-minute or less presentation. I am presenting to you today from Ottawa. I'm here for a National Immunization Renewal Strategy Summit with the National Collaborating Centre for Indigenous Health and the National Collaborating Centre for Infectious Diseases with the Public Health Agency of Canada. But sitting in my glorious hotel room at the Holiday Inn here in Ottawa, which is the traditional unceded, which means stolen, territory of the Anishinaabe Algonquin people. Unlike Saskatchewan, which is 100% treaty territory, the rest of this nation of Canada does not is not fully covered by treaties. So phrases like many of you folks, perhaps all of you folks have heard in Saskatchewan of "we are all treaty people," that absolutely remains true in the province of Saskatchewan. And in the province of Saskatchewan, if any one of those numbered treaties were somehow abolished, people without a status card would have to move. So when we recognize and honor the territory we're on, we really do need to think back to pre-Canada times and thinking about all of the treaties and the promises in those treaties. Something to sit with for particularly settler folks or non-Indigenous peoples, non-Indigenous to Canada anyway, when offering your own land acknowledgement, think about too that in the treaties, there's sides. So there's the Indigenous and non-Indigenous side, if I can break it down into that simplistic type of term. But you would be representing the non-Indigenous side, which is the side of the treaties that has not upheld their promises. So the treaties were something that was supposed to be beneficial for everybody, or at least that's what Indigenous folks interpreted it to be. What it has given to people is primarily focused on the non-Indigenous end of things. Indigenous folks, we feel like much has been taken away from us through the treaties. Whereas when I'm in basic conversation with folks, dinner table conversation, whatever it might be, people start listing or naming all the things Indigenous people get through the treaties, through the Indian Act, etc. But I would argue it's very, very much the opposite. Keep in mind that Canada as a country is the second largest landmass in the world of a country, and over 99% of the landmass of Canada was stolen and then later coerced or forced into treaties, etc. And Canada kept and still keeps all of the prosperity, economic prosperity, and wellness associated with the natural resources, primarily of that 99+% of this landmass, while Indigenous folks, we're still living a reality in this country where many of our communities forget drinking water for a moment. The water's not even safe enough to bathe in some of our communities. So we have a long way to go, and I hope that in your own land acknowledgements, or at least witnessing others, that you add a bit of this critical lens to exactly what is being named, what is being talked about, what is your role as an individual, as a profession, as an institution like the Sask Health Authority, or otherwise. Some of this has been mentioned already, but I like to fully emphasize to folks that I'm very much aware that I am a white presenting First Nations person. So I'm both Soto and Ukrainian. I identify as two-spirit, as queer. I use he and they pronouns. I do live with a non-visible disability, and I'm from Yellow Quill First Nation, which is Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan, although I've spent most of my life in Treaty 6 and the Métis homelands or Saskatoon. My spirit name is Wapiska Kinu, or White Eagle, and I walk with two clans, the Otter clan and the Bear clan. We do separate ourselves into clan systems, and to make some sense of that, at least in like a 15-second description, is that if you were the first human put on Earth right now and had to survive, you don't have human teachers, you don't have textbooks, you don't have schools, you don't have parents, right? If you were the first human on Earth, you would learn from the plants, from the animals, from nature, the sounds, the sights, the smells, etc. Those are our first teachers. So our family lineage goes back to those animals, like the otter and the bear for myself. As a two-spirit person, as a person who exhibits both Western and Indigenous worldviews, even as a middle child, I often argue that I've learned a lot from the otter on how to navigate living in two worlds. And what's also unique about the otter and myself in this regard is that I live with the sometimes unwelcomed privilege of choosing when I am in one world or the other. So I could very easily walk through the streets of downtown Ottawa today as a white man, or I could easily walk through the streets as a First Nations man. And often that comes down to how I'm presenting myself to the world and how the world is perceiving me. So I look to the otter for lots of these teachings on how to live in two worlds. Finally, I just want to bring in my own ancestors and family into this space and honor the matriarchs of my lineage. So at the top left, you see my great grandmother. In the middle is my grandmother, Marina Gilbert. On the top left is Laura Gilbert, my great grandmother. Both of them attended Gordon Residential School, which was in Saskatchewan. And also, it was the last school to close in Canada in 1996. My mother on the top right recently passed in November 2022. She was a 60 scoop survivor and taught me most of everything that I know and that I'm sharing with all of you today. And I also continue to be blessed by Indigenous women around me, both of my sisters, my older sister Shayna on the left at the bottom, and my younger sister Jenna, who's a registered nurse at St. Paul's Hospital in Saskatoon. So, to provide best possible care for Indigenous peoples, we do need to learn the language. So, imagine me trying to show my respect for something like hockey without knowing what a hockey stick is, without knowing when and why helmets were implemented. And if I also called hockey ice ball, or if I called the goalie the catcher, the more and more I'd be speaking and showing my sincere respect, it wouldn't be coming off that way, right? Because nobody told me that, hey, it's actually called hockey, not ice ball. And every time I say that wrong word, it just turns off those hockey fans' brains, right? They're thinking, what does this guy know anyway? What is this person saying? Does he truly care? And yes, I do. But I just am not well versed in the language and the terminology. So that's my goal with all of you today in this short presentation, so that you have the language to be able to demonstrate your true, I hope, and sincere interest in Indigenous people's health and well-being. One of those things is just the very basic term of Indigenous, as an example. So the word Aboriginal comes from the Constitution Act of Canada. So it's a legal colonial government definition that describes who we are. And for many of the language purists out there, you would know that original means not original, which is totally the opposite of what is meant by Aboriginal people in Canada. Aboriginal, as a constitutional definition, is an umbrella term that refers to Inuit, Métis, and First Nations. Each of those are three separate, very distinct groups, but they are all housed under that definition of Aboriginal. And Aboriginal is interchangeable with Indigenous. So when in doubt, I say to folks, use the term Indigenous. But for someone who you do know exactly who or what they are, go more specifically in that direction. So I would not introduce myself as Indigenous. I would say I'm Soto, or Soto in Ukrainian. Um, One step up from that would be status First Nations. If you don't know if the person's status or not, then just First Nations. And then above that would be Indigenous or Aboriginal. My identity stays the same in all of that. I'm just choosing a broader and broader and broader type of term the higher I go up in that chart that you see on the screen. Inuit are really the first peoples of the North, and a single Inuit person would be Inuk. That's the singular term. And the word Inuit is plural by nature and means people. The Métis are another very distinct group, and so biology no longer technically, there's a lot of nuance here, and I encourage folks to check out the Métis Nation of Saskatchewan website for validating, verifying, and accessing your Métis ancestry. But essentially, biology no longer creates a Métis person. So to be Métis today in the here and now, that means that you have Métis ancestors. One of your parents was Métis, one of their parents was Métis, at least one, and so on and so forth. A Métis person here and now today is not classified or quantified by any fraction. So unfortunately, I still hear lots of folks talk about, Joe Schmo is Métis, but oh, he's only like 1/64th Cree. That doesn't make sense. That's not how Métis people are categorized or how they validate their lineage. You have to show which Métis people you are connected to. So basically, when the first settlers, white settlers, European settlers of another landmass came to what we now call Canada, generally it was the white men and First Nations women who had children together, and then those children was the birth of a new generation, a new identity called the Métis. And any descendants of those Métis folks would be Métis. You can be multiple of these identities at once as well. If my dad was not Ukrainian and if my dad was Métis, I would be Soto Métis, still Indigenous, but two kinds of Indigenous at the same time. You absolutely could be Inuit, First Nation, and Métis as well. You could be all of these at the same time. I will note too that the terms Native and Indian, as it refers to First Nations, you'll hear me use the term Indian a few times with reference to the Indian Act of Canada. Basically, settlers way back then thought they were in India and called us the Indians or Indian people, and we've kept that nomenclature right down to legislation. In the United States, Native American and American Indian are the official ways in which folks identify themselves there, the first peoples of the United States, colonially known as the United States. But take a moment just to consider too how that's a little bit interesting in that we tend to add on the term American to many different ethnicities: Latin American, Black American, African American, Native American. But then I ask, who's just American? Who gets to say that they're American? And often that's referring to white folks in general. And white folks were not the first folks of that land. So just an interesting history and nomenclature lesson. People who are status First Nations in Canada will have a status card. This is not a treaty card. So, being from Saskatchewan myself, I know that almost everyone who refers to this card, they do say a treaty card. And technically, in the context of Saskatchewan, if your First Nation, if your reserve is part of a numbered treaty, then it is also a treaty card. But there are many people who are status First Nations whose ancestors and whose bands or reserves did not sign a numbered treaty. So it's not a treaty card, it would be a status card. I would continue to use patient terminology though. I would not correct them. Like if someone came up to you and said, "Oh, do you want my treaty card?" I wouldn't take that time, during their hospital stay or moment of care to correct their terminology. I continue to call it the treaty card if that's how they referred to it as, but I would be asking for a status card, for example, and then I might say, some folks call them treaty cards so that they know exactly what I'm talking about. Some people might have the newer version, like mine on the top, and some people might have the older version, like you see on the bottom. The number that I've X'd out on my own, and then the number that's in black and red on the bottom version, that's the number that pharmacies, that registered dietitians, that occupational therapists, that anyone who's working with billing to the non-insured health benefits program, that's the number that we use in the paperwork or digital paperwork. Who has a status card? Who's status First Nations? Who's not? Well, it's kind of complicated and it comes from the Indian Act of Canada. The 6.1 that you see on the screen and 6.2 represent Section 6.1 or Section 6.2 of the Indian Act. So looking at example 1, Section 6.1 of the Indian Act basically does use blood quantum, saying you have only ever had full-blooded First Nations ancestors. That's basically what 6.1 is described to be. So a 6.1 person and a 6.1 person have a kid. They do not have to be married, as it says in the chart, but they have to have a kid, a biological kid. That kid is 6.1. Makes sense. Like Ukrainian person, they have a kid, the kid's Ukrainian. Example 3 is how I and my sisters came to be. So a 6.1 person, my mother had a child with a non-First Nations person, my dad, who's Ukrainian. That kid is 6'2", according to Section 6.2 of the Indian Act. You'll notice that is not Métis. So I am not Métis and I do not identify as Métis because biology does not create a Métis person. This ends at me though, and it ends at my sisters as well. Looking at example 5 on the bottom right, so my older sister has children with a white man. And so she is a 6'2" woman, and this white man, my brother-in-law, their children, in the eyes of the Canadian government, are non-Indian, non-First Nations, non-Indigenous. But that doesn't really make sense, right? Because like their mother is a card-carrying Indian, and it's not like that ancestry, those cultural teachings, the ways of being just end. That's the colonial government's Indian Act saying this. So this is not how we describe ourselves. So my nieces have the option, and they choose to use this option of self-identifying as a non-status Indian or non-status First Nations person, which is therefore also Indigenous. There's no card given to my nieces or people like my nieces, nor do they have access to non-insured health benefits. This is simply a personal designation or personal way of describing who they are. And the funny thing is that a 6'2" person and a 6'2" person, when they have a kid together, that kid becomes a 6'1" person, according to the Indian Act. So basically, someone like me who's 6'2", according to the Indian Act, not in height, a 6'2" person, I can only have a biological child with a status card if my partner also has a status card, whether they're 6'1" or 6'2". So my child, if I do have a kid with a 6'1" or 6'2" woman or person with the uterus anyway, our kid will be able to have kids with whomever they want, and their kids will have a status card regardless because that person, at least one person, is 6'1". It's complicated. Métis folks, their ancestry is passed on similarly, but through their own record keeping, etc., through the Métis Nation of their respective province. Métis folks may or may not have a card. Same thing with status First Nations. You may not actually choose to get your card, but that doesn't change that you still are very much a First Nations person, Indigenous person. Métis folks, if they do have a card, this doesn't actually get you anything. That's often how people phrase it, is like, what does this get you, right? Well, nothing. It's a validation, verification, affirmation of identity, but you do not have access to non-insured health benefits, for example, unless you're also status First Nation. So if my mom stayed who she is, but my dad was Métis, could have a status First Nation card and a Métis card, but I'm only getting non-insured health benefits coverage through my status card and not my Métis card. The non-insured health benefits program only offers coverage to status First Nations and recognized Inuit. To be a recognized Inuit, you have to have had one of your ancestors be part of a land claim agreement with the Canadian government. Not in the same sense of creating a reservation or reserve, pardon me, um, but a similar process to reserves was held in the far north of Canada. So if your ancestors were part of a particular land claim agreement, then you would be given an N number, not a card. So if you have any Inuk patients, or if you yourself are, you would know that such folks only have like a piece of paper or a picture of their piece of paper showing their N number, which qualifies them to have non-insured health benefits, as an example. They do not have anything more official than that to showcase their ancestry. Here's some more nitty-gritty tips and traps with terminology. So I hear this one a lot, like Indigenous Canadian or our Indigenous people or Canada's Indigenous peoples. Remember that we do not belong to Canada. Indigenous folks existed here far before Canada was even on the radar of consciousness. So we would be Indigenous peoples, plural, capital P and plural, because it's First Nation, Métis, and Inuit with much differentiation and diversity within and across all groups. So by saying Indigenous people, it's creating this monolithic idea of who we are, and that's very much not who we are. Canadians or people in Canada, I see this a lot in like political speeches or various organizations saying, you know, we want this for all Canadians. And then I'm questioning, well, what about newcomers, immigrants, refugees, folks who don't have that official Canadian status, right? So just be conscious of when you're saying Canadians or people in Canada, because one includes far more people than the other. I would never use half or quarter or any form of fractions when describing someone's indigeneity. That would just be like a racist blood quantum way to describe that. And this one's also interesting too, that I've heard folks say things like, um, our new organization, the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada, I've heard folks say this is an organization for people with Indigenous ancestry. Yes, that's true, but also it's for Indigenous peoples because we very much exist here, now, today. It's not just that we have the ancestry, we still are. I think that by framing folks as having Indigenous ancestry distracts from the reality that they are in the here and now and very much just Indigenous versus having the ancestry. Treaty versus status, I kind of commented on this one already. Often status is the most inclusive term because not everyone was part of a signed treaty. And I would even argue, like I mentioned before too, that even non-Indigenous folks, period, could be called treaty people, right? Because you're part of the same treaties. Caucasian versus white. This one I'm working on a bit of a social media blitz. It's not quite ready to go yet, but Caucasian is not polite, politically correct, nor correct whatsoever. So there was a certain region of the other side of the world, the Caucasus region, and then the folks from that region were called Caucasian. In the 18th century, there were a number of scientists who were examining the skulls of people from various regions around the world, and they described the skulls of the Caucasian people as being handsome, the most beautiful. They had a larger circumference of the only specific skulls they had. It's not like they reviewed every single skull that existed, but the skulls that they had were slightly larger in circumference for the Caucasian people versus some Black folks. And so all of this came they came to the understanding that the white race or Caucasian people, they're not synonymous, Caucasian folks were like the most perfect human, superior in terms of knowledge and understanding and brain power just because of the circumference of their skulls, and also the fact that they were light-skinned, blue-eyed, blonde hair was considered to be handsome, beautiful, etc. That was specific to the Caucasian region, the Caucasus region. And so Caucasian does not mean white, nor does white mean Caucasian. They're totally independent terms, and white would not be like a formal ethnic category. And so a lowercase w should be used. So try to no longer use the term Caucasian and perhaps politely correct folks around you who use that term as well, because it's rooted in white supremacy, with the understanding that white folks are just better than and look better than everyone else. Reservations, these are American, this is an American concept. In Canada, we have reserves. So generally, it's the same thing, but we say reserve in Canada and reservation is the United States. Spirit animal, this is something that you could interrupt at supper tables, hallway conversations, etc. Online, I see lots of memes of, some squirrel hoarding something and then people saying like, oh, that's my spirit animal, or, that child screaming on the plane is my spirit animal right now. No, no, they are not. So I think that maybe folks could say like that's my vibe, or mood, hashtag mood, or whatever, something like that. But spirit animal is something quite sacred and central to our understandings about the ways of being and living and knowing and thinking and doing. My name is White Eagle, and I belong to both the Bear Clan and Otter Clan. So spirit animals have very, very sacred meanings and roles and teachings in across Indigenous cultures and communities. I still hear a lot people say, we had a quick powwow at lunch, or let's have a quick powwow in the hallway about this. And part of me wants to be like, powwow, like amazing. Who's the stick man? Who's the drummer? Who's singing today? Like, is there a vendor booth? Or, oh, you meant a meeting, right? So if you weren't actually at a powwow or holding a powwow, then call it what it was, a quick chit chat, a meeting in the hallway. Thinking about the far north of Canada too, lots of folks will say from coast to coast, this is happening, but think of from coast to coast to coast, that will encompass all of the first peoples of this land that we now call Canada. This one is not necessarily shared by every Indigenous person, First Nation, Métis, Inuit person, but my understanding, which is synonymous with many Indigenous folks, I would say, is that everything that we all consider to be medicines rings true. Medications, however, is often the term that we use to describe like a manufactured medicine with a DIN number or a natural product number, something that you purchase, something that a pharmaceutical company sells. Whereas a medicine, we even call laughter medicine, right? Or sage, cedar, sweetgrass, tobacco are four sacred medicines in the Saskatchewan region and area. So all medicines, all medications are medicines, but not all medicines are medications. The medicine wheel. So this image has been used a lot, and I see it a lot, and unfortunately, it's been appropriated a lot too. I absolutely admire the kind-heartedness and strong will and determination of folks who have created things for Indigenous peoples, but there's a risk in doing things for Indigenous peoples instead of with Indigenous peoples, because sometimes harm can result. And so this medicine wheel is one of those areas. Some folks will recall the colors and they just kind of create a circle with four quadrants and colors and call it a day, but the orientation of these colors is very important and central to the teachings of your own nation or region. Also, I will say that not every First Nation, Métis, and Inuit person subscribes to the medicine wheel. It is more common among First Nations and Métis and less common among the Inuit. But when you do see it, it is grounded in teachings. And I won't share all those teachings, but the white is the north, like the spirit world, for example. The sun rises in the east, yellow. The earth, the soil is red, south. And then the sun sets in the west, which is black, and in some nations, blue. My own Yellow Quill First Nation uses blue for the west quadrant. Those quadrants also represent the four seasons, the four stages of life, the four directions, and very, very many other teachings. A smudge, you might engage in conversation if you haven't already with patients and clients who smudge and maybe want to smudge in their rooms while being in an inpatient environment, for example. And so we smudge with usually sage, cedar, and or sweetgrass. Sometimes folks will add a little bit of tobacco in there too, which is the fourth sacred medicine. And basically the smudge is when you light those plant medicines on fire and then it turns into smoke. And if you picture a running water faucet and just flip it around in your mind, that's how one would engage with the smudge. So you see the smoke rising up from the sage in this photo. You would almost like wash your hands in that smoke as though it's faucet of running water. So you wash your hands and then you bring that smoke over your mind, your eyes, your ears, your mouth, your body, your heart, etc. It People use this to pray. They use it to set good intentions for their day, to start a meeting off in a good way, to start a ceremonial day off in a good way, and for very many other reasons. One thing that I share with clients sometimes to bring in, Western and Indigenous worldviews together is that the first time they bring home their blister pack or their vials of medications, to open it up, take the lid off, open up all their vials, and then smudge over top of each of their medicines and just bring both of the medicines and medications together in that way. When referring to traditional elders as a kind of person or a role, a person who holds a specific role, use the capital E. But if I was talking about like elderly people in general, that would be a lowercase e. So an official person, a role, a healer often, capital E. Moontime, I'm careful with how I approach this conversation as a person who does not have a uterus, but I will share that moontime refers to the menstrual cycle. And folks who are on their moontime should not be handling or administering traditional medicines. Um, I'm just getting a bit of feedback from some folks in my headset, if you wouldn't mind just muting. But folks on their moon time should not be administering or handling sacred medicines. I was brought into multiple ethical debriefing situations at St. Paul's, for example, when I was there, when the system and the nurses and the nurse manager, for example, were like, yes, bring in the healer from your community, no problem, we love that. But then the healer said, okay, this is what we want to use for our family member or community member, but please ensure that no one on their moon time is handling or administering this medicine. And so that's where the worldviews kind of collided. So there was a philosophical support for this, but the ways in which our Western healthcare system operates, we don't we don't actually support this practice, because from the Western systems perspective, the nurse managers, other folks can't ask the nurses, hey, are you on your period? Are you on your period? Do you have a uterus? When are you menstruating? I'm going to change the schedule based on everyone's menstrual cycles. It doesn't work that way, or at least not yet in Western society. So this is one way where our worlds don't actually mesh very well when it comes to moon time considerations in healthcare. Unceded, I referred to this briefly in my own land acknowledgement at the beginning. It sounds quite kind and nice when you talk about or share about or learn about unceded territory, but that really just means stolen. So like Ottawa, where I am right now, there was never an official transfer of title. There was no treaty. There was no agreement. It was just simply settlers saying, this is mine now, right? And so we honor that, or try to, by using the term unceded, but really it means stolen. I also hear in writing and verbally a lot about the historical harms, or people who have historically been oppressed by, and that's true, but it's still true, right? There's historical and ongoing, very intentional and unintentional harms toward Indigenous peoples in this country. Missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, Two-Spirit peoples, and other relatives is still a massive issue forced and coerced sterilization of Indigenous women, um, water, not having safe enough drinking water or water to bathe in, for example. So there's very much ongoing harms right now, and it's not just historical. Being Indigenous is also not a risk factor for anything. And the pharmacist, the Western trained pharmacist in me wants to criticize that statement, but the Indigenous person in me or Soto person in me is stomping that criticism down. Usually, when this is brought up as a risk factor for something, what is really meant is racism is the risk factor. So being Indigenous is not a risk factor for the development of diabetes. It is not. Being Indigenous is not a risk factor for the influenza. Being Indigenous is not a risk factor for COVID-19. It's racism, policies and practices that are rooted in racism and white supremacy, of which being Indigenous now places you at a higher risk because of those policies and practices and racism. Simply being Indigenous is not a risk factor for any of those things. And I hope that folks understand and challenge that in their own practices, but also call it out when you've seen it elsewhere. To be quite frank about one specific example is that during the annual flu campaign, I believe everyone should get the flu shot, everyone who's able to and doesn't have a massive contraindication, let's say. So everyone should get the flu shot under Jaris's point of view. But then we also prioritize certain groups. So people who are pregnant, people 65 years of age and over, people in a long-term care home. But then it also says like Indigenous peoples or First Nation Métis Inuit. And that might seem harmless at face value, but it creates this perhaps unnamed perception that Indigenous folks are just so unhealthy, right? We're always listed in all of these priority groups, and it's just creating this concept that we're unhealthy, that we need all this help. But it's not, that's not the risk factor, and certainly not for influenza. I know that folks here will know that influenza is a virus, and if a virus was flying into SaskTel Center right now in Saskatoon at a Carrie Underwood concert, it's not going to look around and be like, oh, who am I going to infect? Ooh, there's Jaris, he's Indigenous, right? Being Indigenous is not the risk factor. It's the circumstances of life, the social determinants of health, which have pushed aside Indigenous folks into an area of vulnerability that makes acquiring influenza more likely. So I think that we just need to be more specific in naming risk factors for things. BIPOC, or Black, Indigenous, and people of color, a decolonial approach to honoring the first peoples of this land, of what we now call Canada. I encourage folks to use a practice that has been shared with me of saying I be POC, or Indigenous, Black, and people of color. So just simply changing the order. I mentioned this one of Indigenous people versus Indigenous peoples, so capital P, plural S, to honor First Nation, Métis, and Inuit, and all of the diversity that exists within and across each Indigenous group. Indigenous knowledge versus Indigenous knowledges. So same kind of thing as the point above. Indigeneity is not one thing. It is First Nation, Métis, Inuit, and even in First Nation, Cree, Lakota, Dakota, Saulteaux, Anishinaabe, you name it. We have so many kinds of folks with our own knowledge systems, our own traditions. So when we're referring to Indigenous knowledge, that doesn't quite exist. I would encourage Indigenous knowledges as a plural. That's a practice used in like the scholarly work as well. The part that I'm going to end with here is just a very brief description of Two-Spirit as we enter very shortly the month of June, which is both Indigenous History Month and Pride. And so this month is kind of like very busy month for folks like myself who identify as Indigenous and as Two-Spirit, for example. So we know that the residential schools that was implemented by Canada and the Catholic Church introduced really rigid gender roles and heteronormative thinking to Indigenous communities. Schools were split up into boys' school, girls' school, the boys' ward, the girls' ward. There was nothing beyond the binary that was allowed. which isn't even based in science. So there has never been a binary, scientifically speaking. Intersex folks, for example, who exist in this world in the same frequency as folks with red hair, have always existed as well. And they are neither independently, solely male or female, but rather intersex. So even sex, let alone gender, has never been binary. The homophobia, biphobia, transphobia that was introduced by the residential schools and government of Canada expanded and still exists. Even some of our own Indigenous communities have not quite returned back to pre-contact times of embracing and celebrating diversity. Those rigid gender roles have really been ironed into people. Two-spirit as a term is meant to be an umbrella term that points to the important roles that two-spirit people held prior to colonization and even still now. How each person interprets that term of two-spirit will differ depending on one person to the next. In general, though, it is said to be an ability and a gift of having a neutral lens and being able to see the world through both masculine and feminine eyes. Often, because of that, we've held very many traditional roles like marriage counselors, guidance counselors. We take in orphans and children who are unhoused and bring together all parts of ways of knowing, being, thinking, and doing in terms of masculinity, femininity into one. Two-spirit is also specific to being Indigenous. So if you're not First Nation, Métis, or Inuit, you can't be two-spirit. There was a singer, Jason Mraz, M-R-A-Z, who at one point identified as two-spirit. He got a lot of heat about that because he's not Indigenous. In most Indigenous communities, two-spirit people were and are still seen, loved, respected as very unique individuals. Many of us hold roles like within our tribes, such as chiefs, medicine people, caregivers, protectors, and knowledge keepers. And like I said too, we often took care of orphaned children. When you see this acronym too, I encourage folks to put 2S at the beginning as a decolonial act as well for the first sexually and gender diverse peoples of this land that we now call Canada. Someone out Saskatoon once said to me, 2S, then the rest, and that really helped me remember things. Plus, even certain concepts like coming out didn't exist in our communities because there was no hiding and there was no shame to being two-spirit. Plus, coming out refers to coming out of the closet, but there's no closets in a teepee, which is like a fun saying, and you can even buy t-shirts that have that and hats and stickers. But it was just another human being a two-spirit person, a gender or sexually diverse person among our communities. That's everything I have to share for folks. I promised I'd once again show that QR code on the last slide here. You can download a copy of the slides, the handout, or I'm happy to engage with people via email, social media. I've listed 3 social media handles here too. So thank you so much for participating, and I love chatting with my fellow Saskatchewan folks, even though I no longer live there. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Jaris. I'm just going to stop the recording here.